Meat's back on the menu! Let's review the Uruk-hai sword from Lord of the Rings. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now obviously you mostly know me for historical weapons, but Peter Jackson's movies, man. I mean, so this is the Uruk-hai. This is obviously a replica of, a commercially available replica of the Uruk-hai sword as featured in Peter Jackson's movies. We're going to talk here about, is this good? Is it bad? How could it be better? I've got some suggestions. But also, does it correspond to what's described in the books? So first thing to say is that the Peter Jackson movies obviously take certain artistic and aesthetic choices that do diverge from the books, and that's absolutely fine. I'm not a purist in that sense. But what's interesting is actually the swords that are used by both Uruk-hai and orcs, we'll talk about the orc swords in a second, are actually sort of correct in the movies, roughly, as far as we can tell, based on the books. In fact, the books don't go into any great detail. So in fact, the books state that the Uruk-hai, as opposed to the orcs, use short, straight, broad-bladed swords that look different to orc swords. In fact, there's a scene where there's 4 dead Uruk-hai, and Aragorn notes that their swords are not like orc swords. Now let's just briefly go away from the Uruk-hai sword and talk about the orc swords. They are specifically likened to curved scimitars. They are described as curved blades. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, in the modern world, scimitar is a European word that derives from a shamshir. Now, I'm not going to get into the sort of politics and social commentary side of it, but it's very clear in Tolkien's works that there are some analogies between certain people and groups in the books and you know, other kind of cultural groups in the world. So this idea that, you know, foreign people or foreign entities and species have curved swords, but people like Aragorn and Boromir have straight swords, that is something very much of its time that is featured in the books. So a scimitar, if we want to call it that, I don't like the word scimitar, but it is a historical word, would be something applied to something like this shamshir. Now, I don't know about you, but in my mind, I actually think Peter Jackson made the right choice. So usually orcs have things which are a little bit more falchion-like. And I think this is a bit too slender and elegant for how orcs are normally perceived and represented. They're quite crude. And ironically, these are some of the most finely made swords in all of history. So I don't think the idea that orcs were running around with shamshir is correct. And, you know, we could kind of move perhaps a bit further down the line to something like a Tartar sword, but, you know, it's basically a saber. But I think that Peter Jackson made the right choice with things that are cruder, more really machete-like, zombie knife, or kind of like kind of ninja sword like, but you know, crude, curved. However, the Uruk-hai swords are supposed to also be crudely made, but they have a different design. The Uruk-hai themselves are like a different people, aren't they, really? So we end up with this, and Peter Jackson's, or probably Weta Workshop, I imagine, designed this actually, in New Zealand. I think it's relatively close to what's described in the books. Now, if we're really purist, you could say that it's vague enough in the books that we'd end up with something like a gladius, but I think this is cool. It fits with the description in the books, and it also fits with the design of Uruk-hai in the movies. The only thing I would say is about the length. So they are explicitly described as short, broad-bladed swords. And this is not really especially short. If I just grab that Tartar sword for a second, I mean, okay, it's shorter, but I wouldn't really describe that as a short sword. It's much bigger than a typical machete is. And I'll talk about machetes in a second. So we have ended up with something straight, very simple, mass-produced, and this is important because, of course, Saruman's army was a mass-produced army, literally, okay, and the weapons were mass-produced. They're described as crudely made in huge numbers, nothing complex about them at all, and so I think in that sense, this is sort of compliant with that. Rough finish, not polished, very simple handle to grip or hilt. We'll talk about some of the features of the design in a second. The only criticism I would make is it looks a bit too factory produced. Now, I know that the concept of the Industrial Revolution and factories plays strong in both Tolkien's writings and the way that Saruman builds up, you know, chops down the trees and essentially builds factories, does an Industrial Revolution in fast time. But I would say that these are kind of too straight. If most of you go out to mass produce a bunch of weapons, they won't be quite as perfectly straight as this. And if you look along that edge, it is absolutely ruler straight, back and front. It looks like something that's made out of bar stock, and I don't think that's really what they would have done. So personally, I would prefer to see it a little bit more wonky, a bit more crap, basically. Right, so let's talk about its features, so to speak. So the grip, very good. So it's 2 wooden slabs either side of a full width tang, very strong, bit like a Langmesser. I like that. It's got this little kind of, I don't know, ridge, what you call it, to put the index finger over. And that's quite useful because on this type of quite simple hilt, there's no pommel on the end. Having something to keep your hand on when you're swinging it is actually quite a damned useful thing. Okay, so nice little design feature. Would that have been actually built into kind of Uruk-hai's mass-produced weapons? I'm not so sure. You could achieve the same thing simply by wrapping the grip with cruder kind of leather. I think actually making a tang with this complex shape, it looks really nice. However, that actually introduces quite a lot more complication into the manufacturing process. It doesn't have a guard, so that's something that's been commented on quite a lot by people who like Lord of the Rings but don't necessarily know very much about weapons. Now, in fact, that's not actually an unusual feature. There are all sorts of historical knives and weapons which don't have an explicit guard on them. An example being the Afghan chora, or Khyber knife as it's sometimes known. So actually, I mean, that's quite similar to a large butcher's knife or cleaver, you know, actually not that unusual. And the fact that the blade overhangs the hand means that it does actually give a certain amount of hand protection anyway. But some people go, oh, but it's a disadvantage that it doesn't have a handguard. Well, not so much really. Remember, things like axes and maces don't have handguards either, but the Uruk-hai are consistently described as using shields. So this is a weapon to be used with a shield. Now, if we are using, doesn't matter what kind of shield it is, if we are using a shield, actually your hand is often protected by the fact that you are using a shield at the same time. So in fact, if we look at swords from all over the world that were used with shields, to be honest, if we go back to the Roman Empire and look at Gladius, that doesn't have much of a handguard either, or Xephos has a bit of a handguard, but loads of swords used throughout history with shields don't have much of a handguard because they don't necessarily need it. So don't have a problem with that. In terms of the size and weight, well, this is a replica, so I can't really judge that. Now, one thing I would say is that in terms of size and shape, this is quite similar to certain types of agricultural tool. I happen to own one which shares some similar features. This is one of my absolute favourite garden tools. And it's a type of machete that is also crossed with a bill hook, and it's very, very good for chopping hedges when I don't want to use an electric or petrol powered tool for various reasons, or if I've just got a quick job that I want to do and I don't want to get the machine out. So very, very useful tool, very good for chopping. We'll come back to that in a second. Fundamentally, yes, it's a good chopping weapon. Thrusting, not at all. You can't really, yes, you could hit someone with the end, and that might be useful against a shield or a face or something like that. However, you're not really going to do an awful lot of damage with this. Yeah, we'll cut someone if it's edged, and I can see that this does have a bevel on it. And that point specifically, if you did want to thrust with it, actually thrusting with that point would be the best thing rather than the end here. Now, let's talk about that hook. So some places on the internet say, the hook is for pulling people off horses. Actually, yeah, I'm sounding critical, but that would kind of work. We know that the hooks on halberds and bills, for example, were sometimes used for that exact purpose. Sometimes not necessarily someone on a horse, could just be someone standing in front of you. You can pull them, you can hook with them. And this is done with things like poleaxes as well. So absolutely, a back spike or back hook is a thing that we find on pole weapons very often. However, here's the thing, and this is my suggestion. I actually think that this weapon would be more effective as a real weapon if it was that way around. Now, there's nothing to stop you spinning it around really, although, and again we come back to this grip design, that little ridge there is actually quite poorly conceived for a weapon that you want to turn around, okay? Because if I am like fighting a certain type of opponent and I want to bring that spike to bear in a forward striking way, then having that ridge in the grip means it's very uncomfortable to now hold that grip with that ridge sticking out into the palm of my hand, which is quite unfortunate. So basically I wouldn't have designed that grip that way, and I probably would have had more of a projection at the back end to stop the hand sliding off. Okay, perhaps something more akin to a falcata. So that spike, in my opinion, should be on the front of the blade. Why? So first of all, you've got all of the benefits of hooking at the front, and it's easier to hook with the front, like with a warhammer or a pick, than if it's on the back. If it's on the back, you're using relatively weaker muscles. It's always weaker going that way than that way, okay? But moreover, armour. So the Uruk-hai were fighting against people like Gondor and the Rohan, riders of Rohan, and they wore armour. Okay, no, not obviously the Uruk-hai do as well, but against armour, straight cutting edges are not really that effective if it's decent armour, even against mail, chainmail. Okay, so rather than just bashing, you've now got a piercing point, and that actually becomes like a warhammer or pick, in addition to a cutting blade. So if the cutting blade was on here, it would still be effective against unarmoured or lightly armoured people, like fleeing villagers, which the Uruk-hai like to slaughter, or you can use that spike if you suddenly come up against that one armoured guy who comes at you swinging an axe, and you can bury that through their helmet or through their chainmail. Very effective against mail, I would say, and that is a more important use of that spike than hooking people off horses. So the example, I'll come back to the machete, actually ends up with something more like this. Now, although this is more of a bill hook cutting blade rather than a spike, this actually has the edge on this way. Okay, now there are some machetes which are that way, but they are only slashing tools. Okay, you can see from the orientation of this grip that it is intended to be used this way, and that's the edge that has that's the direction that the edge is pointing on this. So in my opinion, would be better both as a cutting and a piercing implement with the spike pointing forwards rather than backwards. And there's a safety issue that various people have noticed. When you're swinging something backwards with a spike on the back, you can catch yourself in the face or somewhere else with it. Now, admittedly, there are plenty of other weapons which do that, weapons which have the ability to turn in each direction. So if you want to chop something, you do that. If you want to pierce something, you do that. And they do also have the disadvantage that you've got a spike pointing towards you when you're using the blade. So that is a real historical thing. But nevertheless, so overall, I actually think this is a pretty damn good weapon. I think it fits with the book description. I think it's an effective weapon, but I personally would have changed a few things about it. And these are the key things, just to revise, that I would change about the Peter Jackson Weta Workshop movies version of the Uruk-hai sword. Firstly, I would flip the edge. So the edge is on this face and the spike is pointing forward. Secondly, I would change the shape of the grip so it doesn't have this ridge here, because that means that if you do want to flip the weapon around, it's particularly uncomfortable, and that makes it more time consuming and difficult to make. And instead, what I would do with the bottom here is curl the end around. So all you do is you extend the tang and you curl it around, and that keeps your hand locked in. And surprise, surprise, that's something we find in history. In the Morgan Bible, for example, you find weapons exceedingly like this. So these were very similar to real historical weapons that existed in 13th century Europe. And finally, this is more of an aesthetic thing. It's too perfectly straight. It looks like it came out of a DIY store. I personally would have more of a handmade, rough, kind of slightly wobbly on one key shape, rather than this very like it was drawn on computer-aided design on someone's computer and then laser cut. It looks too perfect and too modern factory produced, rather than Saruman factory produced. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. Do you disagree? Do you think this is completely wrong? Do you think the Uruk-hai should have had some other sort of thing? What sort of swords do you think the Orcs should have had? Should they have had something more like an actual scimitar or, shamshir? Or do you think the falchion, kind of crude zombie knife type thing is the right way to go? I personally think it probably is. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will again be next time, so I hope you'll be here to join me. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.